on the Commission on Justice and Reconciliation. My name is Father David Sawalski. I'm the Vice President for Mission and Identity at St. Louis University. I've been asked to introduce us with the theme of reconciling our Jesuit higher education institutions and its injustices. In our history, there are a few generations that have not had a great project thrust upon them. And for many of those generations, often those great projects were not sought out, though they were embraced, often at great sacrifice. We are at a moment when we are being asked to recognize that it is our time to resolve matters that perhaps should have been resolved long ago. To wrestle with the truth that those institutions of which we are a part and of which we are so proud of were complicit in upholding injustice that favored some, if not many, by exploiting and humiliating others who are denied opportunities to live well without deprivation and otherness. We are not the generation that enslaved. We are not the generation that displaced. But we are the generation that inherits the obligations to recognize that we would not be the representatives of our Jesuit universities and colleges without the unrequited labor of those whom our forebears enslaved. Further, that our society would not have grown in prosperity from then to today without the exploitation of those who are not allowed to share in that prosperity. Acknowledgement must be followed by action. And much like an examen that calls us to admit to shadow as well as to enjoy the light, we do not undertake an examen without also desiring to correct the errors of the past through action in the present. So it is for us, for our generation, to bring about the reconciliation of the present with our past by inviting into our communities those whose forebears were refused admission, and to take inspiration from the words of St. Paul to renew our colleges and universities as places where there is neither Jew or Greek, neither slave nor free person, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. At this time, I'd like to introduce our commission chairs. First, Rochelle Smith, who is the Vice President of the Division for Diversity and Innovative Community Engagement at St. Louis University, and Andrea Whistler, Executive Director for the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service at Georgetown University.
Thank you, Father. Wow. Thank you all so much for being here. This is quite a turnout for this topic, and we really appreciate it. So again, welcome. We are the AJCU Commission on Reconciling Our Jesuit Higher Education Institutions and Justices, focusing on our colleges and universities, complicity with slavery, and its ongoing aftermath, and the historical and ever-present oppression of indigenous populations. Colleagues, we sincerely hope that you are present, you're bringing your whole self into the room with us and helping us to elevate these conversations with us today. So I'm Rochelle Smith, and I'm with Andrea Whistler, as Father has said, and we serve as co-chairs of this commission and have worked together with our members from Loyola Marymount University, Georgetown University, and St. Louis University for the past academic year. And I would be remiss if I did not say how gratified and how honored I am to, number one, have the most stellar co-chair, best to ever do it, Andrea Whistler, and our wonderful committee who has worked so hard over the last year and who truly, all of you all have changed my life. So thank you. Thank you, Father Sawalski, for setting the tone for this session. We know that we need to harness our spiritual and faith-based resources in order to proceed with reconciliation at our individual institutions and as an association as a whole. A few housekeeping matters for our time together. First, please take care of yourselves during this time. This is 75 minutes. It's a long time. If you need to move your body, do so. If you need to take a bio break, do so. Second, this session is being recorded. Our slide deck and other resources are available through the Assembly website. Our slide deck and again, everything that we will say and project here will be on the website for your use. Third, we recognize that learning in this session is hard, and it impacts and implicates each of us in very, very different ways, depending on our personal experiences, our professional trajectories, and our salient identities. Emotional intelligence, epistemic care, intellectual humility, and collegiality is key as we journey together. Please, please take care of yourself.
After our brief introduction, our colleagues will accompany you through their responses to the questions, what do we know? And how do we know what we know? These historians will illuminate the historical context of participation in slavery and settler colonialism by the Society of Jesus and our Jesuit higher education institutions. You will then be invited to participate in a pair-chair activity. Then our colleagues will turn us towards the questions, what do we owe and why? Yes, each one of our institutions is unique in our origin stories, in our curricular foci, in the populations we serve. Yet we share a profound obligation to keep human dignity sacred, to heal the wounds caused by the sins of racism, and to ensure, with all of the strength of all of our assets, that such injustice does not repeat itself. You will be invited to share suggestions for reconciliatory actions. That moment will provide us the opportunity to transition to offering our suggested paths, practices, and processes for reconciliation as individual institutions and as an association. We have included time for audience questions and comments, and we will end with an examen for reconciliation. Our hope for each one of us today is that we will acquire an increased understanding of the historical injustices engaged in by AJCU institutions, an introduction to the potential of reconciliation towards addressing these injustices in the context of Catholicism and Ignatian spirituality and pedagogy, and finally, the ability to evaluate our home institutions using a lens of anti-racism coming from our examen. A precious and possible additional gift of this time together is the creation of a unified narrative, uplifting reconciliation as a fundamental practice of a Jesuit higher education institution, as well as a community of colleagues, all of us here today, willing to engage.
We cannot change what we do not name. It's important for us to acknowledge the land of three fires, Confederacy, which consists of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Other nations, including the Muni, Miami, Peoria, and Sac and Fox, have also dwelled in this region. Join me in remembering these peoples. Lamenting the long histories of settler colonialism that we have endured, that they have endured, and celebrating their cultural vitality. Today in Chicago, it has become the third largest urban American Indian community that still practices their heritage, traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We remember the enslaved Africans who built their early campus, facing separation, dehumanization, shaping our institutions' complex histories. In this work, we hope to mitigate violence and to facilitate healing. In order to do that, we must first name the harmful histories of our institutions and how their colonial legacies persist in informing campus life. Acknowledgement of land, labor, and lives is a first step. It's not in a vacuum. We must pair the naming with action. Again, we must pair the naming with action. And acknowledgements are not in and of themselves sufficient in addressing historical and legacy wrongs. The white supremacy, racial capitalism, ableism, and other matters must be addressed systematically with honest and deep knowledge, awareness, and action. Andrea.
Finally, our charge. Reconciliation and justice begins with an examination of our legacy as AJCU schools, and it extends outwards, reflecting our broader shared commitment to racial justice. Education has been a primary intellectual apostolate of the Society of Jesus and a key activity of the Church. Our universal apostolic preference number 2, walking with the excluded, calls us to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated in a mission of reconciliation and justice. As lay women in Jesuit higher education, we perceive that our personal charge is to ensure that the generosity of commitment from our commission members is honored. We will succeed if every individual leaves this session today really with what St. Ignatius described so beautifully as sentir, that felt knowledge, that you know and feel the pertinence of and urgency for reconciliation. No institution of our association can escape complicity in our country's legacies of enslavement and oppression of Indigenous peoples. Our campuses live with the continuing injustices born from these histories: redlining, anti-Blackness, housing discrimination, disparities in health. They are challenges to a sense of belonging for our members of our communities who have been historically marginalized from higher education. When we care, we learn. Onward.
So now it's our honor to introduce our commission colleagues. And what I'd love for you to do is introduce yourselves and then let us know what universities you're working with and your roles at the universities. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Rothman. I teach history at Georgetown University, and I'm the director of Georgetown Center for the Study of Slavery and its Legacies.
Hello, I'm Katrina Thompson-Moore, Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Louis University. What do we know? We know that Jesuit institutions held slaves, and they benefited from the institution of slavery and participated in every aspect of it. We also know that Jesuit institutions participated in post-slavery segregation, Jim Crow. This is all a common part of our histories.
It's a common part of our histories, and it's a history with local variation that's important for each of us to explore. Before Katrina and I get into the specific histories of enslavement and post-enslavement forms of racist oppression, we want to spend a minute to tell you how we know these things, because that is almost as important as what it is that we know. How do we know these things? Well, we know our history from in several different ways. First of all, we know it from the historical record itself. The things that we're talking about today have extensive documentation, whether that documentation exists in the archives of our universities, in Jesuit archives, or in the oral histories and family histories of the descendants of people held in slavery by the American Jesuits. There is a historical record that documents these things. Secondly, that historical record has been interpreted and examined and analyzed in decades of rigorous academic scholarship, both on the history of the Jesuits and on the history of American and world slavery. This is not coming out of thin air. This is a venerable field of study. And more recently, we also know this history from a series of institutional self-studies conducted by a number of AJCU member institutions. Not all of them, but several of them. And those self-studies are important repositories of really vital information that all of us can use to teach and learn. Now, with that being said, let me give you a very brief overview and one story from the era of enslavement. So here is a chart that shows you the Jesuit colleges founded in the era of enslavement in the United States, and which ones specifically were sites of enslavement: Georgetown, St. Louis, Spring Hill, and Loyola University, Maryland. These are places where enslaved people lived, worked, and died. But I want to make the point that the other universities on this list are not disconnected from that history. Many of them sprang from the universities that were sites of enslavement, and they were connected to them in all sorts of ways through the Jesuit order and other processes as well. So that's part of what we mean when we say this is a common history with local variation. So what do we know about the era of enslavement? We know that Jesuit schools were places where dozens of enslaved people lived, worked, and died. And we have the records of those kinds of activities and experiences. We know that Jesuit schools were subsidized by money earned from the sale of hundreds of enslaved people and profits from enslaved labor. The most famous or infamous instance of this is the sale of the community that we call the GU 272, the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community, in 1838 by the Maryland Jesuits for $115,000. That money continued to flow into the Jesuit order for the next 25 years. The last payment was not made until May of 1862. So these schools were part of the economy of slavery. And finally, we know that the Jesuit schools theologically and philosophically supportive of slavery and racist ideas of white supremacy in their practices, in their curriculum, in the public pronouncements of faculty and leaders of these institutions. So these are some of the key ways that the network of Jesuit schools participated in the era of enslavement. But what does that mean on a human level? Let me very briefly tell you the story connected to the letter, this document that you see on the slide. This is a letter from a man named Thomas Brown, who was held in bondage by the Jesuits originally in Maryland. He and his wife Mary were then forcibly transported to Missouri in the early 1820s to accompany the Jesuit mission in Missouri. Mary and Thomas eventually ended up living and working at St. Louis College, which became St. Louis University. And in 1833, Thomas Brown wrote this letter back to the Maryland Jesuits. You probably can't read the handwriting from where you're sitting, so if I could just summarize it and quote very briefly from it. In this letter, Thomas Brown discusses the terrible living conditions that he and his wife are forced to endure at St. Louis College. He says, "We live at present in a rotten log house, so old and decayed that at every blast of wind we are afraid of our lives." Well, those are the kinds of conditions he's living in. He says that he and his wife have labored faithfully for the Society of Jesus for decades. And now, near the end of their lives, he pleads to be allowed to purchase their freedom for $100. He says, "Let us go free." We have no record of any reply or response to this letter. It does not appear that Thomas Brown and Mary Brown were emancipated. Mary, we know, died in the possession of the Jesuits years later. I tell this story not just because it's a powerful story from the history of our institutions, but because in the thousands and thousands of pages of documentation in the Jesuit records that are housed at Georgetown University today, this is the only document that comes from the perspective of somebody enslaved by the Maryland Jesuits. It is unique, and that uniqueness tells us something about the imbalances in the historical record itself. But I also tell this story to you because as we pursue this history, as we explore and learn about it, we must pay attention to the voices of the enslaved where we can find them. And Thomas Browne's is one such voice.
When you think of many of these institutions who are doing research in slavery for very good reasons because of what was just stated, but there's also legacies of slavery, not only cultural and ideologies, but physical manifestations of segregation, Jim Crow, mistreatment. And all of these institutions are a part of that. So the graph that you see before you shows you from the year that it was founded until it admitted its first Black student and how long it takes. So what you often see is the earlier students are universities take a little bit longer, but this is telling a bigger story. And so when you think about doing this research and learning of this history, don't stop with slavery, because racism does not stop with the institution of slavery ending. It just manifests in other ways. So we started to look at post-slavery institutions that were founded, right? Those who don't seem initially that they would have any relationship. One, financially, the ability to be founded even post-slavery is because of money earned throughout the institution of slavery. So I decided to look at Loyola University of New Orleans. One, Loyola University of New Orleans was founded post-slavery, but the land that it was built on was a former plantation. And so that is not uncommon for many of the land that many of these institutions are built on. Also, I started to look at their desegregation stories. Every university has a desegregation story. There's the one that we tell, and then there's the actual truth of the desegregation story. And so when I looked at Loyola University of New Orleans, I first read that it was desegregated in 1951 with 2 nuns that attended. Then 1952, the law school was desegregated. But it's a lot more complicated than that. In 1921, Loyola starts Loyola number 2, a summer extension program. What took place in New Orleans was teachers, all of a sudden by the school board, needed to get proper accreditation. The problem is Black teachers were having a hard time finding schools to get this, specifically Black nuns. Loyola University was the only Catholic school in Louisiana that offered teacher accreditation college credit. And so what's taking place is they come up with a plan of how do we help Black nuns in the city. However, you can't come to this campus. And so what takes place is the president of Loyola University contacts Seton Hall, and they arrange to have nuns come from Seton Hall to teach on some other property that was allowed to teach these Black nuns. This takes place 1921 to 1936, and it sounds wonderful. In fact, they have college credit from Loyola, so some could consider them the first Black students of Loyola University of Chicago. However, this was a secret. People started to find out in Southern society. So what takes place is there's a new president of Loyola in 1936, and he says, what Loyola number 2? What summer extension program? He gets rid of all of the documents that these students took and sent it to Seton Hall, which is why we didn't know for some time, and denies complete college credit. All of these Black nuns lost their ability to teach in the school system. You have a lapse of teachers that are not present. And they did not register or recognize these students at all. These college credits were never recognized. So when we talk about these histories and these legacies, we have to think about, one, that all these histories are connected. We look at our individual institutions, but we are all AJCU. For example, Loyola University in 1952, when it admitted its first Black law student, it was very late. And prior to that, all eligible, wonderful Black candidates that applied were told to go to Georgetown. And so you have these connections that are continually going on, but we have to think of reconciliation beyond institution of slavery, understanding that to this day, there's a reason that Black Lives Matters are on these campuses and having these conversations. So when we think about the years, we need to really broaden our idea of how we research, learning, teaching, and growing from these histories, and that these histories are complicated. And so this graph shows the founding years of AJCU and sort of recognizing that you have the era of slavery, but you also have this era of segregation, desegregation, and that we need to deconstruct and understand these histories and come together as AJCU, recognizing this is all Jesuit history. And this is all of us reconciling this and moving it forward.
My name is Bobby Wassel. I'm the director and the Center for Social Action at St. Louis University, and I got the extremely easy job of this commission. I just get to ask this question and facilitate a little discussion. So we heard a lot about what we know about the history of the Jesuits and Jesuit colleges and universities and their roles in slavery and colonialism. And so now it's just a chance for you to turn to your neighbor, maybe a couple neighbors, and talk about what you know about your own institution's history of slavery and colonialism. Maybe you're aware of it, maybe you're not. If you're unaware of it, what's a tradition or practice that your institution might be holding on to that might challenge a sense of belonging for members of your community who have been historically denied access to higher education? So go ahead and just take a few minutes to turn to a colleague or two. I know that's not nearly long enough to share. And there'll be plenty of time to ask questions at the end, but if we could close I know I'm the timekeeper and I'm doing a terrible job. If you want to wrap up the conversations, I promise you'll have another chance to talk to these same colleagues in just a few minutes. I also know we'll have plenty of time to ask questions at the end and everything like that. So if you wouldn't mind wrapping up, and we'll give our attention to our next. Is this thing on? I don't know. Is it? That's great. Thank you, everybody. Again, plenty of time to talk again, and at the end.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Prevost, and I'm the Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies at Georgetown University.
And I'm Patrick Cousins. I'm the Director of Pastoral Formation at St. Louis University.
And our role on the commission, or at least for the presentation today, is to ask the question, what do we owe and why? What do we owe and why? So the short answer is that as JCU institutions, we have a responsibility to resist racial oppression in all its forms. So that is our responsibility. We owe that to ourselves and to the communities we serve. Racial oppression includes, but is not limited to, settler colonialism and the conquest of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, and all of their legacies. But we also need to think about forms of Latino discrimination that have happened, especially along the southern border, Asian hate, and so forth and so on. So there are things that our commission did not fully address that would be part of this as well. So what does reconciliation mean? We're hearing this word a lot, but what does it really mean? I took the opportunity to look at the Catechism and see what it had to say about reconciliation. And of course, we know it's one of the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. But this was the line that stood out to me, that's in the Catechism, that reconciliation requires doing what is possible in order to repair the harm caused by sin. And so in this case, that sin would be our institution's participation in various forms of racial oppression. So there's no reconciliation without repair. Or another word for that would be reparations, which means a lot of things. We'll talk about that. So when you hear that word, don't just think about acts of contrition or confession or even absolution. Think about that repair piece. That's really key. Now, I want to make clear that our social responsibility is greater than our liability, and I'm drawing this distinction from the philosopher Iris Marion Young. To understand this distinction, think about two examples. So in one case, let's say you steal something from someone else. Well, that's you've incurred now a debt to that person. You have a liability, and so you owe them that back, whatever you stole. But let's say you're walking along the road and you see someone else getting mugged. Are you going to respond like the Good Samaritan and actually help out? Our tradition of Catholic social thought says you have a responsibility to do that as well, even though you weren't the one doing the theft. And so that larger sense of social responsibility is also important. We need to make amends for the things that our institutions have directly caused, but we also need to be aware of a broader set of concerns in our society related to racial oppression that we also are responsible for in this larger sense. We can see this theme throughout Catholic social thought, and in particular in the writings of Pope Francis, our Jesuit Pope. And I'm referring here to several wonderful passages on solidarity from Fratelli Tutti, which was an encyclical he put out in 2020. But he's really talking about the need to have relationships of solidarity. So repair does not only come in the form of sort of charitable donations or changing names on buildings or things like that, which can be good. You have to actually build relationships with communities and work together on collaborative projects of reconciliation. So let's consider some examples. So just as far as the liability question goes, reckoning with our Jesuit histories, we can work with verified descendants of Jesuit slaveholding and continue to recover their history and also to fund various programs, especially related to education, housing, and other things of that sort. So the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, which was formed in 2019 as a partnership between the descendants of that Georgetown slave transaction in 1838 and the Jesuits, that organization is doing this work right now. And you can Google them, look up their website, find out more information. Another organization would be the Georgetown University Reconciliation Fund. This was sparked by students at Georgetown who asked that they might be able to contribute to this process. And so this is an institution that gives grants to individuals and community organizations that have a potential to benefit the descendant community. There are over 10,000 descendants, verified descendants, that we know of that will be directly supported by these initiatives. But there's millions upon millions of Black people in this country who are descended from slaves, myself included. I looked up my own ancestry to see when I started working at Georgetown, am I one of the descendants? What I found out is that my relatives, my descendants who were enslaved, were just down the road, not more than about an hour away. But of course, they weren't owned by Jesuits per se. But I am one of the 40 million African Americans in this country, and our institutions need to have solidarity with that whole community. So what does that look like? It looks like building relationships. It looks like exercising moral leadership, using our voices, unmuting ourselves to really speak up. I was struck by the historian C. Walker Goller's note that no American Jesuit categorically declared that slavery was wrong during the time of slavery. So that's a sin of omission. And there's a similar deafening silence today, I think, among Jesuit institutions. Where are the calls for a broader reparations movement? Where's the support for H.R. 40, which is a proposal before Congress to just form a commission to study the question? There are reparations task forces underway in California, New York, and Illinois. And the last thing I will say is just right up the street in Evanston, they have a program where to make reparations for redlining Black people can apply for grants of up to $25,000 to help with housing. So where are our Jesuit institutions in terms of advocating for these types of things?
Thank you. Again, my name is Patrick Cousins. I'm from St. Louis University. And I'll be speaking about Jesuit relationships with indigenous populations. Many of you may know, on March 30th of 2023, Pope Francis formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery after years of dialogue between native peoples and the Vatican. But for many non-indigenous people, that event and the centuries that preceded it have been so out of people's experience as to lose the significance of that moment. Some of you may have seen pictures of Pope Francis speaking in Canada, surrounded by a group of indigenous elders. In a nutshell, one of the papal documents that comprise the doctrine of discovery, this one's from 1452, gave the King of Portugal the right to, and I quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to convert them to his and their use and profit, end quote. The doctrine of discovery has since been used in numerous legal decisions, and my law and higher ed professor is right here, so I'm on shaky ground, but she can correct me afterwards. It has been used in numerous legal decisions affecting indigenous persons around the world, not just in the Americas, and it continues to have major effects on indigenous peoples around the world to this day. Because it is so baked into the fabric of international law, the Pope's repudiation is not likely to have any legal repercussions, but it can send a message about the consequences of cultural chauvinism and its colonialist trajectories. While some of our colleges and universities have historically had contact with native populations, more often missions, including churches and primary schools, were the Jesuits' main point of contact with native people. These missions were often established at the request of the people themselves, and the Jesuits' attitudes toward and approaches with native peoples varied widely. While some missions asserted nearly total control over the lives of local populations, many Jesuits went out of their way to learn local languages, to develop written grammars, and form warm relationships with native communities. However, despite the good intentions of many Jesuits, again and again, first contact with Europeans often took incredible cultural and physical tolls on native populations. Outbreaks of diseases introduced by Europeans decimated whole communities. Forced labor was common, and legal and extra-legal violence by Europeans against native communities ran rampant. To give only a few examples. When the Jesuits arrived in the English royal colony of Maryland in 1634, they began working to educate and convert the Algonquin people. But within a dozen years of their arrival, the Algonquin population had collapsed because of massive deaths due to influenza and smallpox, and displacement of the native community by English settlers. Similarly, the native population in California fell from roughly 310,000 in 1770 to around 24,000 by the time the Jesuits arrived in San Francisco in around 1850. At the same time, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California and a member of the board of trustees of what would become Santa Clara University and a close personal friend of the Jesuits there, waged what he himself called a war of extermination against native peoples, sanctioning and providing government funding for hundreds of massacres and vigilante killings against native populations. In 1880, the founder of what is now Gonzaga University, Father Joseph Cataldo, built a school to educate the children of the Upper Spokane tribe. When he decided to open a university, the government of the city of Spokane offered to financially support the new school. No offense to the Protestants, but he took them on that deal because he wanted to beat the Protestants to the punch. But they would support the school only on the condition that it be for whites only. When another Jesuit attempted to enroll 2 native students, that Jesuit was told by the superior of the community that the school was for Americans only, which that superior did not consider native children to be. So what do we owe? We take seriously that this is not a discussion about the past, at least not the past alone. Native people are here. They are everywhere. And if past history is Past history is not divorced from our present circumstances in which Native peoples, on or off their historic lands, are often at the margins of American life and of our institutions. In various ways, Jesuit institutions have been engaged in efforts to reconcile and repair for years. In 2021, the Office of Justice and Ecology of the U.S. Jesuit Conference endorsed a bill establishing a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school practices in the United States. You may also be aware Red Cloud Indian School, which is the only currently operating Jesuit school specifically for Native children, launched its own Truth and Healing Commission in 2019. That's not our universities. For our schools, with our very different histories of engagement with Native populations, what might our work variously look like? First, listening to tribes has to be the first step to understand their priorities. And based on that, we offer a few possibilities, not exhaustive. One, consider how institution-wide land and labor acknowledgements can help disrupt erasure of Native peoples and histories. They're not magic bullets, they don't cure everything, but at least to dispel this idea that Native history is history, is the past. They can help elevate awareness of real harms, past and present, and they can advance hard conversations about how our institutions can address those injustices. We can look to our schools that have already established resources for Native thriving and building right relationships with Native communities. To name only a few, Seattle University's Indigenous Peoples Institute offers student success programming, mentoring, and connections with Native community resources. Marquette recently established a transfer partnership with a local tribal college. USF recently completed a year of discernment on Indigenous engagement, culminating in a very thorough white paper and a set of recommendations for their campus. They also wrote an excellent article on the history of Jesuit engagement with Native peoples. I highly recommend reading it. A recent article from a working group at Loyola Marymount uses the language of indigenizing our campuses through practices such as restoring habitats and educating about traditional ecological knowledge. That's what the TEK is there. Amplifying Native arts and artists, elevating treaty issues, providing scholarships for Native students, hosting Indigenous elders and scholars in residence. And lastly, we encourage taking advantage of the AJCU network to pool our knowledge and resources. Because our tradition calls us to a solidarity rooted in contact and not just concepts, this could look like a sharing of stories of engagement between campuses and Native communities. That could be networks of Native faculty and staff. There are Native faculty and staff across our institutions. Curricular and co-curricular resources that interrogate whose stories and wisdom we teach and we don't. And programs to build knowledge and competence, such as shared immersive experiences for faculty and staff. I just returned from bringing a group of SLU faculty and staff to the Navajo Nation. Could we imagine something similar for partners across the AJCU? All of which the goal is to help one another to learn about the contemporary issues as well as our history faced by Native peoples today. Thank you.
All right, so we heard a little bit about what we know, and you got to talk about what you know about your institution's history of slavery and colonialism. Now we're going to talk about what we owe. So again, turn to those same neighbors, and in 3 minutes, a lightning round, 3 minutes, what is one reconciliatory action that your institution could do to prioritize racial justice, reparations, and reconciliation? Okay, quick show of hands, informal poll. As we're wrapping up, informal poll of the actions that you, just raise your hand, the actions that you were talking about, how many of the actions revolved around something physical, like renaming a building or putting up a plaque or memorial or something like that on campus? Raise your hand if, just an informal poll of the actions that you all talked about. How many of you talked about something physical on your campus, like renaming buildings, memorializing, putting up statues or something like that? Okay. What about educational, building awareness, educating, faculty and staff and students? Raise your hands. Okay. What about financial, scholarships, things like that for folks? Okay, great. Just an informal poll. I'll turn it back over to Rochelle.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you all. We recall Father Marcel's compelling message yesterday. The journey of reconciliation implies that we can never begin to imagine a new future for ourselves until we find ways to remember ourselves differently, to confront our past rightly, and to imagine new possibilities. Our path for our own institutions and our peer JCUs may be unique due to context. There is no one size fits all. The harm has been intergenerational and multidimensional, but we affirm that our paths all begins with us reaching deep into our Jesuit charisma through reflection, introspection, and discernment. We cannot overemphasize that any reconciliation work has to be done with the conjunction and consultation with descendants and Native communities. Again, in Father Marcel's words, with a mysticism of open eyes, looking for defined solutions that are very concrete and have changes in material conditions. So let's get into the concrete. We have a list, we have a list of very practical things that institutions can do. And you might be looking at this list thinking, well, of course they should do that. Yes, and most of these practices are well known, yet they remain underutilized and underfunded, if not non-existent at all on our campuses. We also cannot assume that our students are coming to us at any age or at any level having factual learning of slavery. The Southern Poverty Law Center has shown that it is destructively mistaught. I remember I was in a seminar and I learned that on certain manifests for slave ships, children were listed as adults. For various reasons, I'm checking in with our historians here. Children as young as 11 and 12 years old. So it is destructively mistaught. As a commission, we propose pooling and sharing our intellectual and religious resources as an association to support one another and hold one another accountable to the institutionalization of this work, and so that it does not become a series of one-off programs. This could look like webinars offered to commission members who have created required credit-bearing courses, such as at Georgetown University's Seminar in Race, Power, and Justice, or social justice immersion trips, as we have at St. Louis University. In Native communities, it could look like opportunities for faculty to learn how to conduct research in these areas and ongoing cross-institutional research projects. It could also look like cross-AJCU reading groups. In the past year alone, several significant texts have been published to include Untold Truths, Exposing Slavery and Its Legacies at Loyola University, Maryland, written collaboratively by descendants, students, and faculty. And then there is Let Us Go Free, Slavery and Jesuit Universities in America by C. Walker Goller at Xavier University. I'll now bring up Andrea to talk about more practical things we can do.
Father Marcel also reminded us yesterday that both individuals and communities seek to learn more about themselves. So given this, our commission also asserts the significance of what it means to be a member of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, the AJCU. We believe the association should infuse efforts for racial justice, reparation, and reconciliation into its mission and to its strategies. For example, having a devoted section of the AJCU website should share information about its members' histories of perpetuating injustices. We'd also propose a conference that is cross-positional, across faculty and staff positions, that is transdisciplinary, that is dedicated to the theme of this commission, also to be formed. So among the resources that are provided in our Google Drive that you've heard about just now and today, you will also find the text of a speech offered by Father Timothy Kasicki here with us today. And this was during our Ignatian Heritage Month at Georgetown University this past fall. So to quote you, Father Kasicki, I am here tonight to say at the outset that my words are intended as an invitation for us to move closer to our slaveholding past, closer to the living descendants, closer to the complexity of restorative justice, and closer to the inherent vulnerability and humility that accompanies this important work. So beyond any promising practice that we can suggest, our proposal here is to first and foremost, it's an extension of Father Kasicki's invitation for us to move closer. Proximity is not negotiable. We now invite our colleague Charlene to facilitate conversation with you all.
Hi, everyone. Charlene Brown McKenzie. I serve as the director of CMEA, the Center for Multicultural Equity and Access at Georgetown University. And after being on this panel and commission with these brilliant colleagues, the office that I oversee began, as my colleague said, a desegregation story, admitting the first Black student to Georgetown who graduated in 1953. And its work continues to work with students who've been historically marginalized and excluded from higher ed, and specifically Georgetown. So it is my honor. I will be moving around in this space for you all to begin a conversation with us, to take your questions, comments, and feedback. I'm going to grab the mobile mics and ask a couple of my colleagues to engage with me, but we would love to hear from you in the room. And as you come to the mic, please share your name, your institution, and we open the floor up for question and answer. We also want to honor anyone in this room who is a descendant, and thank you for humbly being here and hearing us as we engage with this conversation largely across the AJCU. And if you choose to identify yourself and share comments, we welcome that as well. So the other housekeeping piece, Untold Truths, for those who came in a little later, they're here for you. And thank you, Loyola University of Maryland, for your new publication. So we open up our session. Please also let us know who on the panel you would like to direct your question to as well. So we begin. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Monique Trustclair Maddox, and I am a descendant. So thank you for acknowledging descendants' presence in this room. I lead the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, and we are a foundation that is really looking forward to not just giving back to descendants, but also changing the dynamics in this country. Outside of universities, changing the dynamics of what has created this really racial and divided nation. Our foundation is putting dollars toward mitigating that risk. So I thank you. And then to my brother over here, I could not help but just really feel something in my heart when you said, I grew up down the road from those people. You are our family as well. So don't feel like you're isolated. We are one family. And we're not here to be a GU group. We represent all descendants from everywhere. My family went from Southern Maryland to Missouri to Sacred Heart Sisters in Grand Coteau, through Pennsylvania, through Massachusetts. It's all over. We're all connected. and we're not here to divide. So thank you, and we welcome you into our families. So thank you for having me.
I'm so honored by that.
Good morning. I'm Matthew Baggett. I teach ethics at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, although I'm very conscious that I don't sound like it. I'm originally from London, England, which leads me to my question for Adam, the historian on the commission. I teach a class on religion and race at Spring Hill, and I think the story for me as a Brit is I've realized that, as well as the history here, I've become very interested in the way in which we in England and Great Britain are reevaluating our colonial history and the implications of that legacy. And one of the moves in history, so I'm aware, is the internationalization of history. And so as a Jesuit body, I'm very curious how this becomes internationalized and what are the resources for us internationally. Is that part of the agenda? How might it be? Because we are global citizens after all, and I think one of the strengths of the Jesuit tradition is, of course, we are an international body with international networks. So I'm very curious about the international history and our place in the United States in regard to other nations and regions of the world and the bigger picture, perhaps. And I say that in all humility, in that I know that we have a big enough picture here to deal with, and so I don't want it to get out of hand. But I'm just curious about the international ramifications of this. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question, and Dr. Moore can offer her own thoughts as a fellow historian as well. So I think it's a great point. Just one piece of data, perhaps. When the Society of Jesus was suppressed in the early 1770s, just before that, historians estimate that across the Americas, the Jesuits owned somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 people across the Americas, from Brazil all the way up through Maryland. And the Maryland Jesuits were really only the northernmost outpost of a vast transatlantic slaveholding complex that the Jesuits had been involved in from the middle of the 16th century. So it's a long and international history. Jesuit colleges across the Americas held enslaved people in much the same way that the Jesuit colleges in the United States did. And it was really a global phenomenon. There's a special issue of the Journal of Jesuit Studies on the Jesuits and slavery, which places the question in precisely this international context. That's where this information is coming from. So I think there are many ways that we could internationalize this question of the Jesuit entanglements with slavery. And I think it would be fascinating to see some colleges and universities in the Jesuit network outside the United States wrestle with this question from their own perspectives, histories, and traditions. And I think that would only enrich the conversation. And I just want to add one thing, which is at Georgetown, where we're really heavily invested in teaching these questions, a lot of students, especially international students, will say, well, what does this have to do with me? A lot of students say that. And this is one, looking at this as a global phenomenon and not just a question about the American history is one way of doing that.
Thank you, Adam.
Hi there. My name is Evelyn Rodriguez. I guess I should go over here. Sorry. And I'm at the University of San Francisco. And thank you for this session and for all of the work that this commission has so thoughtfully put into sharing this with us today. And thank you for asking that question, because it's been something that I've raised with my partner all afternoon. I just want to reframe it. I don't think it's strictly the internationalization of what we're studying here. The imperialism, US imperialism, it's a national project. It was part of our nation building. And so I do hope that this is something that the commission and that our larger Jesuit family will continue to explore, and that when we think about it, we don't think about it as something that's just beyond us, but something that's helped to construct us.
I think we have one question here and probably chance for one more because we are close to being at time. We apologize. Oh, you already have it.
You go. Now it's on. I'm Pam Zarkowski from the University of Detroit Mercy, and again, I want to say echo everybody's comments. Two comments. As you think about resources, for example, I think that's an excellent idea of sharing and expertise. I mean, we had a very significant Underground Railroad project in Detroit, so again, something that hasn't been addressed when we talk about history and different strategies. And maybe this is over a cocktail, but discussion, but we do the land acknowledgement at the university, but it's selective. And so university ministry does it, or mission integration does it, but I don't know that everyone has bought into it. And you'll see a little bit, I'm exaggerating, of eye rolling. And so as we think about different ways we can address things, I think your point about education, but multiple levels of education, not just students, board of trustees and staff, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not really a question, but more how do we engage everybody in understanding why and what we're doing.
Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. Really, I've learned a lot. To go quickly to the question, when you are dealing with something of such heavy history, you are also dealing with denials. People who deny the gravity of what happened. And I can say that from the context of Rwanda, a lot of the end of a genocide or even mass atrocities is often the last stage of the genocide or mass killings. What is good here is actually an acknowledgement that is clear and evident. But sometimes acknowledgement also can go along with minimizing the extent or the gravity of what happened. So how does AJCU deal with denials or minimizing the gravity of what has happened? So I hope I'm making myself clear. Thank you.
Colleagues, we are almost at time, so we want to transition. This does not end here. We want to honor that there's more conversations to happen and have, and we will transition to my colleague. Thank you so much.
This is just a reminder that we do have links to our resources, and this will be available to you. We also offer to you an examen for reconciliation and justice. And a sample script is available under the resources. We also have postcards up here that gives you an outline of how you might formulate an examen if you were to lead one at your institution. And there is a link, a QR code on this postcard that sends you to our sample script. But we'll give you a little bit of a taste today. So we're gathered here to reflect deeply on legacies of slavery. Oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. I'm Emeline de la Peña. She, her pronouns. I'm the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Loyola Marymount University. We're gathering to reflect deeply on the legacies of slavery, indigenous oppression, and the historical injustices of stealing lives, land, and labor. We will use the Ignatian Examen as our guide to seek reconciliation and justice in our lives and communities. Before we begin, I invite you all to take a moment to settle into your space. If you want to close your eyes, feel free to do that. Feel the presence of those around you and the presence of God with us. We begin by giving thanks. Let's reflect on the moments today, the moments yesterday, where you saw or felt movement toward racial justice and reconciliation, particularly in addressing the legacies of slavery and Indigenous oppression. Silently give thanks for these moments, the people, and the experiences that have positively impacted your journey towards acknowledgement and healing from these historical injustices. Let's just pause for a few seconds. This might be the point when you are leading this examen that you might take a little bit longer, but for today, we'll just take a few seconds. Now let us ask God for the grace to see clearly the areas in our lives and community where reconciliation and justice are needed, especially regarding the legacies of slavery, Indigenous oppression, and the theft of lives, labor, and land. As Father Marcel reminded us yesterday, let us pray for the wisdom to recognize our own biases and the courage to face uncomfortable truths about these historical and ongoing impacts. Seek the strength to act with integrity and compassion in promoting racial justice and healing from these wounds. Let's take a few moments for silent prayer. Now, as you review the events of today and as you experience the next 2 days, remember to reflect on how you have engaged with the lived realities of racial justice and reconciliation, especially concerning the legacies of slavery and Indigenous oppression. Consider these questions as you reflect. Where did I see or experience acts of racial justice or reconciliation related to the legacies of slavery and Indigenous oppression? How did I contribute to or hinder these acts? Did I encounter any situations where justice or reconciliation was compromised or needed but not achieved? How have I interacted with people of different races and backgrounds in the past and today? Were these interactions marked by respect, dignity, and equity? Reflect on the historical context. How does the history of stealing lives, stealing labor, and stealing land from marginalized communities, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples, impact current relationships and structures in my community and life? And now let's acknowledge and reflect on the moments where we fell short in promoting racial justice and reconciliation. Consider these questions. Were there opportunities to stand up against racism and Indigenous oppression, or the ongoing impact of historical injustices that I ignored or that I avoided? Did I hold on to any issues of biases or prejudice? Were there times that I perpetuated oppression? How have my actions or inactions affected people? And let us look ahead to tomorrow and identify ways we can promote racial reconciliation and justice. How can I be a peacemaker? What steps can I take to address and rectify injustices? Let us conclude our examen with a prayer, asking for God's continued guidance. God of justice and peace, help us to see the dignity in all people and to recognize the injustices they face, especially those rooted in the legacies of slavery and Indigenous oppression. Give us the strength to confront our own biases and the courage to stand against racism, the stealing of lives and labor and land, and the ongoing impact of these historical injustices. Guide us in our efforts to promote reconciliation and justice, And may your love inspire us to act with compassion and integrity. Amen. Thank you all for participating in our examen.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to invite Father Sawalski up to give gratitude.
So this will be our closing prayer. And I've chosen one that we've got in the St. Louis University prayer book by Father John Kavanaugh, who was a longtime philosopher at the university, who died too young, which means in Jesuit world, he died before his 90th birthday. So let us pray. That I live, that I breathe, that I see and hear, even a little, that I have a heart to feel, a mind to know and remember by. I thank you, most bountiful and close God, made one with us in Jesus Christ and present to us, even in the million ways I forget. Amen. As a reminder to all, we have complimentary books, Untold Truth, as well as the examen cards, which you're free to take with you. Thanks so much for joining us today.